I want to thank you again for the kind and generous introduction. After 2 nights of trying to find this room in this building, I think I now have it down. I was out here trying to find the men's washroom to spruce up, which is a euphemism, I think. And someone directed me to the wrong door, and it said paleontological objects. And I can assure you that there was little comfort in that room. So be careful if you're looking for the washrooms in this building. They are not clearly labeled. The second thing to say is that I had prepared a text tonight on the subject presented for you, but someone voluntarily gave me another one outside. So in the interest of this week, I think I'll read that one instead. My topic tonight is the structure of voluntarism and the redefinition of the church's mission. And I'd like to begin with a quote from a man by the name of Sir James Stephen, who was an outstanding Christian leader in Great Britain at the turn of the 19th century, which is usually assumed to be the great century of the voluntary association. Ours is the age of societies, he wrote. For the redress of every oppression that is done under the sun, there is a public meeting. For the cure of every sorrow by which our land or our race can be visited, there are patrons, vice presidents, and secretaries. For the diffusion of every blessing of which mankind can participate in common, there is a committee. End of quote. All of us in religious culture know about the truth of what he is saying. My reason, my driving, compelling interest in the topic tonight is to address, among other things, the chronology of writing about voluntary associations. Most writers in the British and American and Canadian context assume that voluntary societies grew up at the end of the 18th century. They did not. And over the last year, my research has shown me that the idea is a lot older, it's a lot more complicated, and involves a lot more than the dissenter groups that are usually associated with voluntary associations. In last evening's lecture, we explored the evolution of the principle of voluntarism from a debate focused on the human will to a full-blown practical theology, if you will. Voluntarism demanded more than a theoretical rationalization. The voluntary spirit required a structure or pattern for realization of its potential. Put another way, the best laid sermons, I'm afraid to say, and theologies of mission and benevolent work necessitate organization more than anything else. And it took 1.5 centuries for voluntary enthusiasts of the best order to discover this reality and craft the right mold. In other words, I'm laboring on the theme tonight, the how-to of voluntarism is as important or in many ways more relevant to the subject than the theology or the rationalization. The dynamic vehicle, that is the means by which the principle of voluntarism is most vividly employed for religious purposes, has been the voluntary society. Formally launched in the early 18th century, there are 5 influential factors which ultimately led to voluntary societies. 1, legalized philanthropic efforts. 2, colonial trading companies. 3, Anglican moral improvement organizations. 4, overseas missionary endeavor. And 5, dissenter benevolent organization following the Act of Toleration. I'd like to spend the next few moments tracing that evolution. The idea of a society, which is a key word, has its origins in ancient collections of people with a common interest or purpose. Some historians associate modern voluntary societies with professional clubs or social cliques in ancient Egypt or Greece or Rome, or clerical orders, as was mentioned last evening in the Middle Ages life of the church. Yet others see parallels in the guilds and coffee houses of Europe in the 16th century. Literary and political clubs in France and England are interesting precursors also. I can't say, after my own research, just where the idea may be singularly identified. By the mid to late 16th century, the term society is in common usage to denote a partnership or combination with respect to a business or commercial transaction. In the first sense of the term, a society was defined as a number of people associated together by a common interest or purpose, united by a common vow, holding the same belief or opinion, or following the same trade or profession. The Oxford English Dictionary, in its etymological notes, says that the term was used first in locatable literature in 1548 to denote the Order of the Garter, and in 1581, the Society of Jesus, a parallel not lost on later Protestants. A secondary definition indicates that a society is, quote, a number of persons united together for the purpose of promoting some branch of study or research by means of meetings and publications, etc. In the 1660s, the Royal Society was defined this way. The term had a broad business and social usage as it came to be applied for religious purposes, probably about 1650, with reference either to the New England Company or the Sons of the Clergy. More about them in a moment. Much of voluntary religious association in its early development was directed at benevolent or charitable concerns. Gaps in social services for poorer persons were the most obvious place for voluntary endeavor to occur. The Christian community has often been at the vanguard of such activity, arguing in a number of ways, from sermons to papal pronouncements, that it is inherent in the Christian gospel that one should assume to some degree responsibility for the spiritual, if not the material, well-being of others. History demonstrates, on the other hand, that political and economic structures are naturally protective of their resources and arrive at improvements and progress only through lengthy self-evaluation, change in leadership, or conflict. Voluntarism, then, occurring on the eve of the modern era of English history, and it is an English phenomenon primarily, provided a new alternative for church and culture which had a far-reaching impact upon existing political and social structures in Western civilization. To exist, voluntary associations in the 17th century English context required several supports. First, a class of persons had to be free to make choices and effect change. This occurred with the rise of a middle class in European life, which had mobility and improved social status. Second, there must be available capital or financial resources to support the endeavor which the voluntarists propose. The clearest target for voluntarism in the 16th and 17th centuries were the wealthy, and this was the place where voluntarist writers aimed their sermons and tracts. Soon, also the lower middle classes, organized in dissenting bodies, gave evidence not only of their desire, but their capability to volunteer their resources. Finally, voluntary associations required an opportunity to operate, preferably without legal harassment. This occurred first in commercial enterprises, second in the political community, and third within religious structures. An important component of my thesis, and I would argue my thesis for the evening, is this: voluntary associations for religious purposes are predicated upon earlier and parallel experiences in business and politics. Voluntary Christian endeavor won its legitimacy from the other spheres of influence. Legal foundations of social benevolence are a point that one can't miss when you are doing research in this area. Voluntary contributions to religious projects were mitigated by determinist theology, ecclesiastical control, lack of adequate models, and importantly, a hostile political environment. One might say that everything in society at large was antagonistic to voluntarism on an organized basis. Even with the appearance of businessmen and a social elite with a social conscience, a legal structure and tradition had to evolve to allow for voluntarism on a large scale. Individuals required protection, as would potential associations. In the English context, this legal foundation was constructed over several centuries. I might add, having come from the alumni banquet where a presentation was made asking for a voluntary response, we take for granted the legality and the structures that protect and influence such gifts. This is part of the story that makes it all possible. As a principal of a theological college, thanks be to God. The most pressing social needs in the pre-modern era included care of widows and orphans, public education, care for the sick and victims of natural disasters, such as plagues. Higher education was in there, and maintenance of church and public buildings. From time to time, the monarchy would sponsor a collection, such as the Queen's Bounty, or issue a royal letter. That really wasn't very voluntary. More often, wealthy citizens or members of the royal families would become patrons of a project, such as a hospital or a lectureship, and they would raise funds for the project. Beginning in the reign of Edward I, King of England, 1271 to 1307, a series of parliamentary statutes were passed encouraging something called mortmain, or legal protection for money or possessions to be left to a social or religious organization for spiritual or charitable purposes. In the 16th century, such recognition was expanded for estates and gifts given to chantries, colleges, and church maintenance. During the Elizabethan era, social concern increased for relief of the poor, education of children, and again, the ever-present need to repair and maintain church buildings. One of the most significant pieces of legislation to receive approval was the Statute of Charitable Uses, approved by Her Majesty Elizabeth I in 1601. It enumerated a miscellaneous list of approved charities. The court treated the list as an index for administrative purposes, and the net result was actually an inducement to give to the charities. Over the years, the list, as it came to be known, included maintenance of tombstones, gifts to vicars in the Church of England, always well taken care of, and by 1660, even the restoration of the monarchy, which was in dire straits. Of more direct interest, though, were free schools, universities, houses of correction, aid to young tradesmen, and bread for the poor. The list was the precursor of government-approved, tax-exempt charitable bodies. Yes, Revenue Canada does have some historical precedents. Excluded, however, as of 1581, actually stepping back as a control over the 1601 statute, were all trusts, that is, agreements to use resources for a special purpose by a custodian for the purposes of any form of Christianity outside the law, particularly Roman Catholics. They could not give to Roman Catholic charitable concerns and be protected. This meant that while persons could and did leave sums of money for benevolent purposes, among dissenter groups there was no enforceable protection should the custodian not honor the intentions of the donor. In 1688, however, with the Act of Toleration, certain Protestant dissenters were given some relief, although anti-Trinitarians, Roman Catholics, and Jews were accepted. Gradually, nonconformist bodies tested the law and found new liberty. Courts upheld their identity as charitable and valid. A gift to support nonconformist ministers in 1684, which was originally held to be invalid, 5 years later was tested again and upon appeal was validated. The difference was toleration. The test of legal validity as a charitable fund or society came to be, and hear this, public benefit rather than theological orthodoxy. The classic decision was made by Lord Sumner in a case that is well known to the legal profession, Bowman versus Secular Society, issued in 1689. The question, writes the justice, whether a given opinion is a danger to society is a question of the times and a question of fact. The attitude of the law, both civil and criminal, towards all religions depends fundamentally on the safety of the state and not on the doctrines or metaphysics of those who prefer them. Interesting. Some nonconformist donors were drawn to specific concerns even before the Act of Toleration. Edward Terrell of Bristol, England, was typical. A wealthy sugar merchant of Bristol. He had long indicated an interest in education, and in 1679 he signed a deed of gift amounting to over £700, which went to the pastor and deacons of his church at Broadmead, Bristol, for the support of ministerial education in the original languages. What eventuated, folks, was the first Baptist institution of higher education ever, Bristol Baptist College. His plan involved using the pastors of the congregation as trustworthy custodians, some weren't, and tutors for the students. His surety before toleration was the confidence he placed in the diaconate board of the church. Following 1715, the trust was made public, and eventually a voluntary society emerged to superintend the designs of the benefactor. Almost every one of the dissenting academies, some of which have become major universities, had their origins in the pre-toleration period of experimental benevolence. So much for the legal foundations that had to be in place. Voluntarism and commercial structures. English colonial expansion in the Elizabethan and Jacobean period provided the occasion and the vehicle for another important route of voluntary associationalism to evolve. By the first decade of the 17th century, colonial interest had grown beyond individual exploratory efforts to permanent settlements. This required more capital and sustained management than either the Crown or a single proprietor could muster. Thus, the relevance of the joint stock companies. Historians of business and commerce believe that it was the joint stock principle that emerged in England about 1550, a gift from the craft guilds to develop new forms with new financial resources in industry. Some theorize that international traders like Sebastian Cabot of the famous John Cabot clan brought the structure from Italy as a protective device against solitary, selfish trading and profiteering by guild members and servants. By 1570, the joint stock company was a fact of major proportions. In England, it is estimated that year that there was a capital stock of over 75,000 available pounds sterling, the majority of which, by the way, was devoted to trading experimentally in Russia. Of particular interest to later voluntary associations were administrative aspects of joint stock companies. What I'd like you to do for a few sentences is think about the way in which your church or some parachurch organization is constructed, what is required of you as a member, and listen to the antiquity of some of the structures. The companies frequently sponsored annual convivial feasts with a series of penalties for absence. Funds for the assistance of members were kept, as were careful records of the business. Often a seal was used to certify transactions, and yes, audits were regular. Bylaws were frequently created with officers and assistants elected by the membership to administer the company. The chief officer, and we're talking about business now, was usually referred to as the governor or president. An annual fee in the range of about 5 shillings was levied for membership, and lifetime memberships were also frequent. Scores of such companies using these principles were started in the 1600s for purposes like trading and placing English immigrants in Ireland. Numerous insurance companies owe their origins from the period 1700 to 1715. They amassed huge sums of capital with joint stock management. Louis B. Wright, who is an Anglo-North American historian, observed from the beginning joint stock companies realized the value of religious influence in the promotion of their enterprises, and they made a systematic attempt to win the support of the English clergy. The interest of clergy leaders peaked with the announcement of the intention to evangelize the natives and preach to the slaves as an important part of the colonial enterprise. This led to a 75-year concern by some in the church for missionary work overseas. But just as importantly, the church itself became involved in a larger commercial effort and gradually adopted one of the leading principles from the business community. The supreme value of the joint stock venture was that it allowed a group of persons who were sufficiently endowed with capital to pool their efforts and accomplish a goal, namely profit-making. The charter given to the Virginia Company in 1606 explicitly stated the interest of evangelization, and from its inception to its dissolution in 1624, it was faithful to the task. The company employed several preachers regularly to deliver sermons to shareholders, paid them in cash and shares of stock, and gave them invitations to become shareholders. Many of those who understood well the management of ecclesiastical affairs learned the lessons of contemporary risk capital business ventures. Until the Puritan Commonwealth, those holding clerical orders were basically bystanders or shareholders as invited guests. But all of that begins to change during the reign of Oliver Cromwell. Many of the New England divines and their English counterparts were concerned for the evangelical plight of the Native American population, and none more so than one whom I mentioned last evening, the Reverend John Eliot. Eliot, who won the sobriquet Apostle to the Indians, not only translated Scripture and preached to the native peoples, but he also spearheaded the organization which established the first substantial mission effort to Indians in English America. His writings, principally in tract form, one after another, for a period of about 25 years, provided the Puritan leadership with the necessary theology to launch the project. On July the 28th, 1649, Parliament approved an act for the establishment of the New England Corporation, which called for, quote, the educating, clothing, civilizing, and instructing of poor natives, and also for the support and maintenance of such ministers of the gospel, schoolmasters, and others involved in the proposed effort. In addition to John Eliot's writings, the legislation was the work of Edward Winslow, one-time governor of New Plymouth, who is credited with using his considerable powers of persuasion to move the idea to fruition by heavy use of the media, primitively so-called in London, in the closing days of the Long Parliament. Winslow himself joined the original court, or administrative committee, of the corporation to ensure its tactical success. The importance of the New England Corporation for our purposes is that it laid the foundation for the structure of later voluntary societies for religious purposes. Imitating the earlier joint stock arrangements, the corporation was essentially a society or official association of 20 persons chosen for their wealth and influence. What pastor wouldn't like that kind of group to work with? Physicians, lawyers, businessmen, independents, Presbyterians, all of them Puritan. A court served as the administrative committee with 20 appointed members meeting annually to review the work of the society and approve expenditures. The underlying purpose of the corporation was to raise money for Indian missions, and the profit came to be the number of souls saved. The 1649 Act actually called for each minister in the Commonwealth to read the Act, this is during the Puritan period, once per year and make a collection on behalf of New England. Thus, a modified form of voluntarism characterized the New England Corporation as gifts were solicited of the wealthy classes with the authority of Cromwell's entire ecclesiastical machine. The New England Corporation pioneered several techniques in promotion which later voluntarists would rely on as a sine qua non of operation. First, the society established a network of support bases, the congregations of the church in England. Within the group, the corporation was particularly interested, quote, in such well-affected persons as God shall stir up to respond to our invitations. Interesting theology. Each county, the basic political unit of the kingdom, was to have a treasurer who would receive the collections from the ministers. This individual was to be a person of recognized social quality. Parish ministers were to be responsible for going house to house to reach every inhabitant with the annual appeal. In addition to using the church infrastructure, newspaper ads featuring letters by Eliot were purchased in London papers and elsewhere, as well as approval statements by prominent clergy. One such letter aimed at municipal corporations, the so-called foundation approach, and London's aldermen reminded such persons of wealth that the highest use that money can be put is the furtherance of religion, and the best way of gaining by it is to lend it upon interest to the Lord. Oliver Cromwell himself was even moved to invest upon interest on behalf of the corporation. The New England Corporation lasted for 11 years through the Protectorate. During its first phase, a total of £15,000 was collected. Personal collections produced only 1,200 of that. The Army gave £3,000, and the cities of London and Yorkshire each contributed about £1,100. The society members recognized that while voluntary contributions were the preferred means of support, greater income would ensue from investments. The decision was made in 1653 to secure rental properties in London, and with other investments, this form of financing actually produced £4,000 sterling in 7 years, from 1653 to 1660. Among the deficits of the initial 11 years, the corporation found it difficult to identify fit instruments for collection. The clergy could not be relied upon. And the flagging interest of the members beyond the immediate administrative court. Today in the talkback session, someone raised the point of how you keep the interest going as the group gets larger and larger. It's an age-old problem. To his death, John Eliot continued to be the attractive device in the project. Moral of the story, get someone or something that attracts the largest number of interests. The corporation, given legal status under Cromwell, was transformed into a royal company on December the 1st, 1660, with the Restoration. The original society met for the last time and relinquished its work to a new group of charter members, many of whom were ministers who had not incurred the king's displeasure during the Protectorate. Under the leadership of a distinguished scientist and social activist, Robert Boyle, as governor, the 45-member New England Company was entrusted by the Crown with putting an industrious people, the Englishmen, into a way of trade and commerce, but more especially endeavoring the good and salvation of the immortal soul of the Indian. More and more, the chief means of support for the work came to be the collection of rents from properties throughout England rather than contributions. Estates left to the company, such as that of Monsignor Morsky of Paris, valued at £360 alone, were routinely invested in real estate properties. Gradually, the New England Company evolved in membership to a list of businessmen and nonconformists, particularly after 1702, when the Church of England founded the Competitive Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. With close ties to New England Puritan and Congregational leaders, this was only fitting, and the number of dissenters and Baptists like William Kiffin, a very wealthy restorationist, increased. The pattern was confirmed in the next century when care was taken to stack the decks of the New England Company with wealthy dissenting deputies. Unhealthy relations erupted between the New England Company and the New Anglican Society, largely as the leaders of the company perceived that the Anglicans were up to no good. Why, they were developing their own organization to convert Congregationalists and Presbyterians to the Church of England more than Indians to Christianity. At one point in 1714, William Ashurst, the governor of the New England Company, defamed his Christian fellow workers in the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel as that cursed vermin of the high church for sponsoring an investigation of the New England Company's charter and boundaries in New England. With only 2 English societies in the Americas, there was already developing that imperial sort of religious competition that we all know and love. The remaining years of the New England Company to 1776 are of little interest in the course of voluntarism. Its chief contribution has been to provide an experimental bridge between commercial ventures and religious purposes, which its leaders quite adequately managed for half a century. Voluntary association for religious purposes. The work of the New England Company undoubtedly encouraged the promotion of the missionary efforts of the Church of England. Before the founding of the SPG, or the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, However, there were other efforts of important voluntary association for renewal purposes. The Anglican model actually emerged not so much from antagonism with Puritans as an entirely different set of circumstances. Long before toleration was granted, even in a limited degree, to certain nonconformists, regional confessional bodies had been formed for mutual assistance, fellowship, and benevolence. Baptists, for instance, as early as 1626, voluntarily associated near London, and by 1660 met annually in an assembly. Likewise, Quakers and Congregationalists followed the pattern in 1647 and 1658, respectively. This was in spite of civil and ecclesiastical prohibition of such associations. A major link noticed by historians in the early 18th century in the chain of evolving voluntary associations emerged in the 1670s with a lay renewal movement in the Church of England. Religion in general during the Restoration period languished behind the morally lax example of King Charles II, and the Church of England felt the depression the most. Many commented publicly about the apparent disregard for morality, the improper public conduct among young persons, and the decline in church attendance. Two streams of response were forthcoming: the so-called religious societies and the societies for the reformation of manners. Under the able leadership of a pastor named Anthony Horneck at Savoy, groups of young Christians formed religious groups dedicated to personal renewal and spirituality. The principle involved recovery of membership in the church through consistent attendance at worship, Bible study, group encouragement in practical holiness, and acts of charity. Each band or society was regulated by rules, a leader, and election to membership by the body politic. They frequently went through the rolls to see if persons were serious about the commitment. The process of weekly meetings for catechism and encouragement was a direct product of Horneck's familiarity with the German pietists August Hermann Francke and Philip Jakob Spener, of whom we spoke last evening. A second stream was the Society for the Reformation of Manners and Morals, a most curious group. The first one began in 1691 by an Anglican priest named Edward Stevens. These not necessarily religious groups focused upon identification in secret of violators of public decency laws, whom they turned over to the appropriate police authorities. Spitting in public could put you in the clinker in London if one of these overly concerned persons caught you. Young persons in the trades, lawyers, a few clergy, and many nonconformists were involved in the widespread effort to improve morality, decrease drunkenness, profanity, and prostitution in the early 1680s and early 1690s. Informers were protected by anonymity, and the results were quietly impressive. This is long before Queen Victoria. A variety of people modified their lifestyles, it can be noted. Public houses were closed, and schools for poor children were started. When the Bishop of London expressed concern, because Anglicans were more often the subjects of the investigation, about the potentially subversive nature of these groups, he was told that their only design was to quicken each other's affections towards spiritual things, and that the pious education of our youth is a matter of greatest importance to us both in church and state. God forbid, he reported, that I should be against such excellent designs. What the societies for the reformation of manners and morals and the religious societies demonstrated is that there were unaddressed social and religious needs in English society that laypersons and clergy below the levels of ecclesiastical leadership were deeply concerned about. Sound familiar? Their response was to organize voluntarily and formally to improve the circumstances and call the religious institutions to account. A providential coalition of reforming and evangelical forces active in the 1690s occurred in the life and ministry of Thomas Bray, perhaps the most significant figure of religious reformation between Oliver Cromwell and John and Charles Wesley. Born in the West Country, bordering Wales, educated at Oxford, Bray was a schoolmaster, a curate, a colonial special agent, and an ecclesiastical organizer, an honest-to-goodness agent 007. In his 30-year career, he restructured overseas mission for the Church of England and refined the voluntary principle to the point where the great advances of the next 100 years were possible and predictable. This, folks, was an Anglican. Between 1695 and 1699, Bray served as a special agent for the Bishop of London, Henry Compton, who desired to improve the condition of the church in the colonies. At the request of colonial governor Francis Nicholson of Maryland, Bray set about reforming the church in that colony as a model. Through several important publications, including an essay towards promoting all necessary and useful knowledge and Bibliotheca Catechetica, Bray advocated the establishment of lending libraries for the deaneries of England and the creation of parochial libraries for Maryland, Virginia, and other plantations. His philosophy was simple: get the clergy to read, and all of society will be improved. Bray was the most formidable leader in his church for 2 decades, and he left in his wake the first public library system in the empire and an organizational structure that would become a model for direct, concerted, voluntary action. Thomas Bray's plan to meet the concerns of lapsed piety at home and colonial church development was first aired in 1697. Bray noted with keen interest and anxiety the effectiveness of organized Roman Catholic missions, I mentioned this last night, under the title Congregatio Pro Propaganda Fidei, and he proposed to form a Protestant congregation and society for promoting Christian knowledge as opposed to Catholic knowledge. At its helm would be the highest clergy officials in the church, plus the ever-present laymen, eminent for their worth. To ensure the longevity and capability of the society, Bray proposed that it secure a charter similar to the Royal Society, organized for scientific improvement, or the Sons of the Clergy, organized in 1678 to assist widows and orphans. The object of Bray's society would be to promote religion and learning in any part of His Majesty's plantations abroad. Curiously, Bray continued to refer to his Anglican society in the original plan as the Protestant Congregatio Pro Propaganda Fidei. At the heart of the first proposal was a 5-fold task. The society was to provide support for missionaries. The missionaries were to have a special concern for native Indians and Negro slaves. Libraries were to be created. The proposal included assistance for widows and orphans of missionaries who served overseas. Finally, the society was to furnish libraries and schools all over England and Wales for the education of poor children and clergy. Bray envisioned the charter that would grant power to receive donations, grants, property, and legacies, much as the New England Company had been doing for half a century. Bray knew that securing a charter would be a long and costly process, and he was not to be put off by political circumstances. On March the 8th, 1699, he and 4 of his well-meaning friends met at London's Lincoln Tavern to form themselves into a voluntary society called the Society for the Promotion of Christian Knowledge, affectionately known as SPCK. The fivesome contributed their own funds and met weekly to tend to new memberships, publication projects, and the library plans. In anticipation of overseas travel, Bray wrote the first manual of operation for a missionary society for his absence, and he remained the chief figure in its growth and development. In a subsequent memorial or position paper for his colleagues, Bray advised the creation of a stock of printed works to be distributed. This was the germ of the SPCK's fabled book publication work, and it presaged the Bible Society movement, which I might add the most major historian of voluntary societies thinks is the germ of it all, by a full 100 years. Next, Bray proposed that clergy of high personal and moral reputation, there were few of those, he thought, be induced by prebendal fees to take up missionary service for the SPCK. He was interested in the education of Indian youths to return to their own people to share the gospel. Not unaware of another irritant to the Church of England, Bray urged that efforts be made to reduce the Quakers, who were totally apostatized to the Christian faith, by sending missionaries to them. He was accused by leading dissenters of developing a plan to strengthen the Church of England and to diminish the chance of nonconformist growth in the colonies. He did work well with some dissenters at home, but the accusation was not unfounded, given his targets of Catholics in Maryland, Quakers in Pennsylvania, and Indians along the Northeast coast, where the New England Company was already at work. But in the religious world of the 17th century, that was not surprising. The SPCK was, for the most part, a success in its efforts to produce literary works and create libraries. Now and then an Anglican bishop questioned them as extra-congregational, but the support that Bray and his associates enjoyed from the Archbishop and the Bishop of London overruled. The society joined forces with the religious societies and the manor societies and produced tracts against immorality, tracts in favor of keeping the Lord's Day, and tracts for the salvation of those in prison. It supported a recent convert from Quakerism by the name of George Keith to take up a mission against Quakers, and it lent funds to assist continental Protestants in Denmark and Germany against Roman Catholic persecution. Because of the success of his school for pious youth at Halle, August Franke, a leading Lutheran pietist, was selected as a long-term beneficiary. It was a very comprehensive program that Bray instituted indeed. Bray's idea of a missionary society which would commission ministers to work in the colonial plantations was embodied in the second of his organizations, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, or the SPG. It was granted a royal charter on June the 9th, 1701. The SPG was a basic improvement on the SPCK. It had the official recognition of government. It took the posture of being the official instrument for its designated purpose, evangelism in the king's plantations. And it could receive, invest, and administer funds in a formal manner. With a membership of 90, which included by design, 2/3 clergy and 1/3 such gentlemen of the laity as are eminent for their worth and affection toward the Church of England, the society was first a voluntary association. The fund from which the disbursements would be made was to include first payments of their own members, whose contributions are voluntary and who may withdraw themselves from that body and the support of it when they please. But recognizing that method alone, again, would not produce sufficient support, the charter allowed the society to increase their income in proportion to their expenses by a public collection among the wealthy. Further, the society could engage in real estate and business ventures to round out their fund. Critical to the advancement of the SPG was its annual appeal. With the Archbishop of Canterbury, the bishops of London, York, and Exeter providing model annual contributions, they would actually deliver it in a great crowd. An anniversary service was held in a prominent London church. Care was taken to have knowledgeable and enthusiastic supporters invited. And the annual sermon, usually by a bishop or deacon or dean, would expound a passage of Scripture interlacing the history of the society. Then the sermon was printed with the advertisement for the need, and that came out on an annual basis until the 1940s. Of equal importance to these annual meetings were episcopal letters, or better yet, the infrequent royal letters, which invited parishes throughout the diocese or realm to receive a general collection from all the churches for the stated purpose. Queen Anne, a frequent personal patron of the SPCK, was convinced to issue a royal letter for the society in 1711, and again in 1714 for all the ports that traded with the American trade. The chief competition of the SPG proved to be its own voluntary organization, parent, the SPCK. In its first decade, the SPCK averaged £600 annually in voluntary contributions. The SPG contributed almost double that, or £12,000 sterling, in 10 years. Both were a testimony to the organizing genius of Thomas Bray and to the growing attraction and ability of voluntary associations for religious purposes. The coalescing of dissenter voluntarism. The achievements of the SPCK and the SPG, coupled with the earlier work of the New England Company, proved to be worthy examples of action for dissenting denominations. Robert Nelson, an oft-quoted religious writer and enthusiast for the early 18th century voluntarism, observed that there were, for nonconformists in 1715, two general areas of need for benevolence: those which assist our souls and those which pertain to our bodies. Among the 11 projects he espoused pertaining to spiritual matters were urban church buildings, Bible and tract distribution, theological schools, foreign missions, church renewal, and libraries. Men like the eminent Dr. Daniel Williams, an independent pastor, lecturer, and philanthropist, and Henry Ashurst, a London merchant, made possible the advance of the idea among dissenters. As dissenter movements grew numerically and became more organizationally complex, leading pastors and laymen looked for opportunities to meet the special needs of their co-religionists. Among the earliest pressing issues were theological education of ministers, the care of clergy widows and orphans, and the need to provide a united political witness in defense of religious liberty. Baptists, Independents, Presbyterians all pursued these objectives within their own boundaries and in the establishment of something called the Three Dissenting Denominations, an umbrella group of voluntary organizations. The Presbyterians were the first of the dissenting groups to organize their resources for a special purpose. In London, on July the 1st, 1690, 13 of Presbyterian ministers formed a voluntary association to provide for itinerant preaching. They called themselves the Presbyterian Fund. Wisely, the clergy found 30 more gentlemen to join them in monthly meetings and membership in the fund. Curiously, and this was underscored in the Presbyterian literature, no liquor or tobacco was to be taken while the chairman presided, upon pain of penalty of 6 pence to be given to the poor. Congregationalist leaders, ever suspicious of domination by Presbyterians, organized their own fund for the benefit of their work. On December 17, 1695, 38 of them met at Nathaniel Mather's meeting place, and they reflected on the leadership of the congregational churches. One of the differences in the Congregational Fund, which shared much the same purpose as its Presbyterian counterpart, was the congregational approach to management. Messengers of the congregations about London were to be the fundraisers, and church messengers were to carry the funds. Ministers were not trusted. In due course, the fund managers broadened their benevolence to care for indigent ministers. That solved part of the problem, offering to pay everything from wages to apothecary bills. Among the Congregationalists, there was a stated sense of denominational identity to be maintained. That is, those who benefited from the fund were expected to be of the same persuasion in faith and order with ourselves. And the Baptists as well, who benefited from neither the Presbyterian nor the Congregationalist, built strategies for their funds. Partially a response to colonial Pennsylvania's request for assistance, partially the leadership of some outstanding Baptist worthies like Thomas Hollis, who gave the first chair of endowment for Harvard College to make sure that Baptists would have an education and freedom there. The idea of a particular Baptist fund was raised in 1717. A Baptist board was organized eventually of outstanding London pastors to determine the suitability of churches and candidates. And the board operated for a number of years right through the end of the 18th century. General Baptists, by the way, who were excluded from the particular Baptist funds, started their own fund, which gave money to any who agreed in the practice of baptism by immersion, Reformed theology and Calvinism notwithstanding. Presbyterians, Congregationalists, and particular Baptists all recognized their continuing vulnerability as dissenters. In addition to the sectarian voluntary networks that emerged from 1690 to 1720 in assistance funds, there was close cooperation of another kind. As Jeffrey Nuttall has shown, the origins of something called the three dissenting denominations probably were to be found in 1702 when Daniel Williams and others addressed Queen Anne on the continuing penalties of the Test Act. Dr. Williams, an astute religious politician, received the support of Congregationalists, Presbyterians, and Baptists. The purpose of his coalition was to present a united, voluntary dissenter identity to convince Parliament and the established church of the power of English nonconformity. Dissenter leaders found additional opportunity for other action. Eventually, this body, known as the three dissenting denominations, actually hired lawyers to draw up model deeds and trusts that could stand the test of Anglican and Presbyterian and other style lawyers who sought to unravel the nonconformist trusts and estates. On the basis of such use, the dissenting deputies were able to defend legally dissenter claims in the courts. By the conclusion of the 18th century, the three denominations had provided a permanent ecclesiastical legal frame of reference for English voluntary associations to enjoy the status of legal and social recognition that was lacking when toleration was issued in 1689. The 18th century thus witnessed the development of voluntary structures for domestic mission, education of the clergy in academies, and care for widows and orphans. The growing recognition of these bodies to hold trusteeships, invest funds, and maintain properties made voluntarism in the English context permanent and acceptable as a vehicle of self-expression, mission, and benevolence. On the eve of the great theological revision from John Gill and all of the other staunch Calvinists to Andrew Fuller and the Evangelical Revival, and the advent of the World Mission Crusade, which was renewed in the ministry of William Carey and the Baptists, legal recognition for benevolence was no small achievement. In conclusion, the voluntary society, with roots deep in the established life of English Christianity and commercial models, launched a new era in Christian life and work. During the 17th and 18th centuries in England and British North America, structures were tested, techniques invented, and social recognition achieved. Gifted Christian leaders learned the power of concerted voluntary action. They learned how to establish funds and distribute them for benevolent concerns. Importantly, they learned that voluntary Voluntarist success rests upon the nurture of a constituency, constant attention to publicity, and good business procedures, something every theological school principal needs to learn as well. Perhaps most significantly, they realize that the methods and persons of proven success in secular pursuits could be harnessed for the kingdom of God without much transformation. The growth of organized voluntarism for all levels of society and English religious affairs reflects a pattern of keen observation of cultural transformation. The 19th century was dawning, and its organizing principle in religious and social affairs would be voluntarism. As Alexis de Tocqueville, a French political analyst, observed following an extended visit to North America in 1840, in aristocratic societies, men do not need to combine in order to act because they are strongly held together. But amongst democratic nations, on the contrary, all the citizens are independent and feeble. They can hardly do anything by themselves. They all fall into a state of incapacity, God forbid, if they do not learn voluntarily how to help each other. Here endeth the matter.